Well, good morning, or good morning, good evening, everyone. Oh, it's been a long day, I guess. I want to welcome everyone to the our second session of our Eastside Fall Forestry Seminar on the topic of disturbance fundamentals. And so I'll just take a minute here and run through just a couple of logistics items here before we get started and jump right into our speakers. So for those of you that didn't join us for the first week, just so you know, and you probably saw the little pop-up that the webinars are being recorded and will be posted on the Washington Tree Farm website shortly after each session. And for your questions for the presenters, those can be typed into either the chat box or the Q&A function that you can see on your screen. Each presentation will be about 45 minutes and then allow approximately 10-15 minutes for Q&A at the end of each presentation. And then after the first presentation, we'll plan to take approximately 10 to 15 minute break to allow everyone to take a stretch break and get away from your computer screen for a little bit before we start with our second presentation. At the end, towards the end of the evening, I will drop a link for a survey to give us some feedback on the webinar. I'll drop that also in the chat box, and also it'll come out to you in an email shortly after the seminar. And I guess I just realized one thing, I didn't introduce myself. So my name is Darren Gooding. I am the Eastern Washington Inspection Coordinator for the Washington Tree Farm Program. And great to see some good participation here to join us this evening. And we'll just go ahead and jump. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And we'll just go ahead and jump right into our first presenter of the evening. So I want to introduce Dr. Melissa Fisher, her topic will be discussing helping us understand biotic and abiotic disturbances. Melissa is currently the forest health specialist for the Northeast region in Washington, based out of Colville with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Melissa.
Okay, I just wanted to start by saying that I'm going to turn off my video because I have really bad internet here, and it often seems to affect how you can hear me when it's on. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And then I will share my screen. Okay, and hopefully everyone can see that. So my topic is understanding biotic and abiotic disturbances. And this PowerPoint is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, this talk. My focus is usually on insects. And I decided after much thought that I'd try to give you a presentation that would make you think about the subject of disturbance and how it relates to forest health. So with that, I'm just going to jump right into it. Let's see if we're moving forward here. Okay, there we go. So I'd like to begin by defining disturbance. A disturbance is any relatively abrupt change in biomass, resource availability, or ecological structure or function. It can be a selective agent of mortality to a single species, such as a disease outbreak, a consumer of biomass, such as a fire, or the mechanism by which organisms are displaced, such as a landslide. A disturbance event may take just a few seconds, or it could go on for years. We often think of disturbances as negative events, but disturbances are a natural and vital part of our forest ecosystems. While some disturbances affect community structure and organization with little mortality, such as a tree falling in a stand and creating a gap that facilitates regeneration, some cause extensive mortality, such as wildfire. But what happens after a wildfire? A new stand is typically born. Think about aspen stands. Aspen is a pioneer species, meaning that aspen is often one of the first species to grow back following a large disturbance. It's a sun-loving, short-lived species that is replaced over time by conifers. Fires tend to facilitate regeneration of aspen, and this increases biodiversity, not only of the tree species present over the landscape, but also the wildlife and understory plants, as different species prefer different stand types. So disturbances may influence forest structure, composition, and functioning. They may facilitate regeneration, increase biodiversity, initiate forest succession, and they can even induce evolutionary change. The impact of a disturbance is variable and can depend on many things. Think about these factors in relation to fire and how they may affect the forest. The intensity and severity, frequency, duration, the spatial distribution or pattern, the size of the disturbed area, the season in which it occurs, history of the disturbed site, topography, tree characteristics such as height, age, health, and stand characteristics such as species composition and structure. So disturbances may be generated by biotic living forces, or they may occur as a result of abiotic non-living forces. Biotic disturbances will include those insects and disease that we're pretty familiar with, bark beetles, defoliators, root disease, heart rot, and foliar diseases. Abiotic disturbances will include things such as weather events, hailstorms and tornadoes, geological events such as landslides and volcanoes, and of course, wildfire. So what about human disturbance? Many disturbances are caused by humans: de-icing salts, pollution, water diversions, and the majority of wildfires. So should we include humans as part of nature? Should these be considered natural disturbances? What about the prevention of natural disturbances such as fire suppression? Should that be considered a disturbance process in itself? I often get calls from landowners to help them deal with bark beetle issues. They're very concerned because they're seeing acute mortality to the trees within their stand. While the beetles are certainly causing the mortality, what I'm looking for and trying to piece together while I'm there is why the bark beetles are there to begin with. Bark beetle infestations did not begin for no reason. There's always a catalyst. There may be multiple catalysts. Bark beetle outbreaks, as well as many disturbances, rarely act alone. Bark beetles may have killed the tree, but the reasons why, perhaps drought or a nearby lightning struck tree, may not be as obvious, but are probably the more important factor to cue in on. There are endless examples of disturbance interactions. You may have two abiotic interactions, such as landslides triggered by earthquakes. You may have an abiotic-biotic interaction, such as wind throw as a result of root disease, weakening tree root systems. There's abiotic and human interactions, such as wind throw following recent thinning, and biotic human interactions, such as a pine engraver outbreak that occurs as a result of leaving pine slash following it thinning. And some of these interactions are random, such as a hurricane plowing through a recently thinned forest, but some are not random, and we know quite a bit about them, such as bark beetle outbreaks following drought. And some occur as a chain of events, such as this glacial retreat that led to a landslide, generating a tsunami, as occurred in Alaska in 2015. And then there are feedback loops, which become even more convoluted. Lodgepole pine is a really good example of this. Even age stands of lodgepole pine tend to establish after insect outbreaks or fires. They eventually develop into dense, mature stands that then become susceptible to future insect outbreaks and fires. And after they occur, they once again grow back as even age stands of lodgepole pine. The cumulative effects of multiple abiotic and biotic factors is called a decline. Forest declines have been conceptualized as death spirals, such as Mannion's spiral pictured here. The spiral is basically showing that more than one issue causes the death of a tree. First, a predisposing factor, such as changing climate or site conditions, reduce the ability of a tree to withstand injury or biotic attack. Then, short-term inciting factors, such as drought or defoliation, result in the first symptoms of decline and the reduced ability to tolerate adversity. Finally, contributing factors, including a variety of insects and pathogens, result in mortality. So in a decline, accumulated stress results in the inability of a tree to tolerate or resist unfavorable conditions, but also the inability to respond to favorable conditions. If those predisposing conditions were not present, the tree might actually be able to recover from the inciting and contributing factors. Together, the predisposing and inciting factors lead to mortality of the tree. There are many recent forest declines incited by drought stress. A good example is aspen in Western US and Canada. There's also yellow cedar in Alaska, oak in Eastern North America, and pinyon pine in the Southwestern US. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the predisposing factor, climate change. All climate change predictions indicate that there will be major changes in precipitation and temperature. And I believe we are seeing these changes now. There are a lot of factors involved in disturbance interactions, which make it very difficult to predict what will happen to our forests as the climate continues to change. Think about all the different disturbance interactions we just talked about. Think about Mannion's spiral. Think about the characteristics of each individual disturbance, such as frequency or severity, and then the characteristics of each individual stand of trees, the species composition, the density, the soil type. It's really hard to predict what will happen next year, given all those factors, let alone years from now under a new climate regime. And I think this is kind of a good example. Douglas fir is considered a drought-hardy tree relative to species such as grand fir. Predictions regarding the future of Douglas fir as a component of our forests here in the Pacific Northwest under climate change have been rather optimistic. When the future of Douglas fir in our stands may not be as clear as we thought, given what happened after the severe drought of 2015. In the years following that drought, we began to see several secondary bark beetles attack and kill Douglas fir. Secondary bark beetle species are called secondary because they come in second after something else has already killed or is killing the tree. In the years following the drought of 2015, several species of these secondary bark beetles apparently built up large enough populations in dead and dying drought-stricken Douglas fir that they began killing apparently healthy Douglas fir. These beetles are very small, therefore they were killing sapling-sized trees, but they were also killing mature trees one branch at a time. The mortality due to these species was unprecedented. It was something that we did not predict. And it suggests that maybe Douglas fir won't do as well as we thought under a climate change scenario. It also suggests that something of this nature could happen with any species we consider resilient under climate change. So these hot droughts we've been experiencing are of great concern. The eastern portion of Washington is in an exceptional drought. This is the first time in the history of this drought monitor that I'm showing on the screen that Washington has ever entered an exceptional drought. I expect that we're going to see a lot of mortality in our forests the next several years due to this drought and the associated disturbance interactions. Drought and high temperatures alter the frequency, intensity, and timing of disturbance events such as fires and insect and disease outbreaks. In recent years, there has been a notable increase in large wildfires, or megafires as they're now called, in all regions of the world. These conditions also facilitate the spread, reproduction, and development of pathogens and pests. Additionally, warmer temperatures are changing the distribution and range of pathogens and pests. And here I'm showing you an example. The mountain pine beetle's distribution has changed. The red shows its historic distribution, the blue, the new distribution, and the arrows are pointing towards its possible future distribution, which would devastate the boreal forest in Canada and would certainly cause many issues in the northeastern forests in the United States. So let's talk about a current decline that is occurring in Washington state. I decided to focus on white bark pine because this is a species that a lot of people are probably not familiar with. White bark pine grows at high elevations in the subalpine and timberline zones, where most of the growing season moisture is derived from snowpack. White bark pine are long-lived trees. The oldest documented individual is on the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. It's greater than 1,270 years old. White bark pine is ecologically important. A good example of that is the loss of Clark's nutcracker populations may have negative consequences for other pine species as well, because there are seeds that are dispersed only by the Clark's nutcrackers. White bark pine has been listed as an endangered species in Canada and was proposed in 2020 listed as a threatened species in the US. So this study that I'm going to talk about is out of Colorado, but the mechanism of decline is likely the same or very similar in other regions, including ours. So why is the species on the decline? Basically, increased drought stress due to climate change has predisposed white bark pine to white pine blister rust, an inciting factor, which is leading to the mortality due to a combination of contributing factors, including bark beetles. And so let's look at these issues more closely. So I stated the predisposing factor was drought as a result of climate change. This is actually a very broad statement because the nature of the drought is not straightforward. We're not just talking about a simple lack of rainfall. Drought conditions for this species have been brought on by unprecedented reductions in snowpack, coupled with earlier spring melt and longer summer drought. In addition, droughty conditions have been made worse by a cold Pacific decadal oscillation phase that occurred prior to the decline. And you can see it at the end of this graph here when you're getting right before the 2000 mark. Cold winters led to deeply frozen soils. When temperatures warmed in the spring, the tree roots were unable to transport water due to the frozen soil, which added to drought stress. Additionally, several moderately strong La Nina events occurred during this period, leading to drier conditions. This drought stress predisposed white bark pine to white pine blister rust. White pine blister rust is a non-native pathogen that was introduced in North America from Asia at the turn of the 20th century. This pathogen affects white pines and is the cause of the loss of our western white pine as well, as a major component of our forested stands. White bark pine is not adapted to white pine blister rust. Therefore, this species has no resistance to infection. White pine blister rust slows growth, and it acts much like a root disease would, causing hydraulic impairment. So it makes it hard for the tree to move water. This, in combination with drought stress and warming temperatures, lowered white bark pine's resistance to bark beetles. In many cases, mountain pine beetle has been the contributing factor to mortality, basically the nail in the coffin for white bark pine. Historically, outbreaks of mountain pine beetle were rare at high elevations because cold temperatures killed the overwintering beetles. But these warmer temperatures we've been experiencing have increased beetle survival, and it's increased their development rates, allowing them to expand their distribution into high elevation white bark pine forests. In this study, white bark pine ultimately died from mountain pine beetle, its species beetles, or blister rust. So in this case, blister rust acted as both an inciting and a contributing factor to forest decline. So there is a lot involved in decline. Multiple interactions amongst abiotic and biotic factors are leading to mortality. So let's talk about a species you might be more familiar with, Western red cedar. When I began to work here in 2014, one of the first things I noticed was how bad the Western red cedar looked, just about everywhere I went. And after talking with other forest entomologists and pathologists who were also located in the range of Western red cedar, I discovered they were seeing the same thing too. So one of the main symptoms we've been seeing is thinning crowns. We've also been seeing quite a bit of chlorosis, which is yellowing. We've also been seeing browning crowns, and sometimes this is due to large cone crops, but not always. Other symptoms include branch flagging and dieback, top kill, and mortality. Western red cedar is fairly insect and disease resistant. There are secondary beetles which may infest stressed or dying trees, but they are not aggressive species, at least as of yet. Sometimes we find sites where Western red cedar is infected with root disease, and it often has heart rot. But although we've seen this damage at some sites, we're not seeing it at all sites. And given the apparent range-wide dieback and lack of consistent biotic factors, we hypothesize that the predisposing problem is likely abiotic. We have been seeing an increase in droughty periods in the Pacific Northwest, especially during the summer months, and an increase in temperature. Interestingly, the dieback is not just located at dry, rocky sites. We're also seeing it at sites where you expect it to be doing well, such as along streams. Therefore, we believe there is much more going on than just a straightforward drought damage, similar to white bark pine. So let's take a look at the case of another Cupressaceae species, Alaska yellow cedar. This species is believed to have been on the decline for more than 75 years in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. Drought and lack of snowpack have been related to the decline, but this interesting hypothesis for the decline shows that the specific causes may be more complex. A distinctive trait of the Cupressaceae family, under which both yellow cedar and Western red cedar fall, is that they accumulate calcium in their tissues. Why calcium? Well, trees need nitrogen. Many conifers uptake ammonium, but cedars preferentially uptake nitrate as a competitive adaptation on marginal sites. A byproduct of nitrate assimilation is oxalic acid, which is potentially a toxic compound. Calcium neutralizes oxalic acid to form calcium oxalate. In other words, cedars are using the calcium they're accumulating as a detoxification process. Cedars have two features which help with uptake of both nitrate and calcium. One is early dehardening, and that's when plants' tissues lose hardiness and are ready to resume growth early in the season, and also shallow rooting. Early hardening of yellow cedars allows the fine roots near the surface to access soil that's rich in ammonium and calcium in early spring. The strategy only works if the roots are protected from freeze-thaw events that induce root injury. Historically, consistent snowpacks have limited soil freezing and protected roots from extensive damage. But depths of snowpack, particularly at these lower elevations in northern latitudes, have declined during the 20th century. The shallow depth and early spring activity of roots that historically enhanced this competitive status of yellow cedar on wet sites may now be the reason behind its decline. So could this hypothesis for yellow cedar decline be applied to Western red cedar as well? Maybe. It would explain why we're seeing Western red cedar dieback in areas that appear to have plenty of water year-round, but obviously a lot of research still needs to be done. So hopefully by now I've successfully explained that it is the interaction of biotic and abiotic disturbances that drives forest health, and that these interactions can be quite complex. The interactions among abiotic and biotic disturbances are not the only complexity involved with forest health issues, though. There's also your definition of forest health and the scale at which you are working. What is forest health? Often we define forest health with the term ecological stability in the definition somewhere, balance. Ecological stability is defined as a tendency of an ecosystem to return to equilibrium following environmental disturbance or stress. It is a function of two related characteristics. One is resistance. Resistance is defined as the ability of an ecosystem to remain unchanged when being subjected to a disturbance. Another definition is the capacity of an ecosystem to remain largely unchanged despite stressors or disturbances. At the very beginning of this presentation, I stated that disturbances are a natural and integral part of forest ecosystems. And what is a disturbance? A disturbance is a relatively abrupt change in biomass, resource availability, or ecological function. The second characteristic of ecosystem stability is resilience. Resilience can be defined as the ability and rate of an ecosystem to recover from a disturbance and return to a pre-disturbed state. Or another definition is the capacity of an ecosystem to regain its fundamental structure, processes, and functioning when altered by stresses and disturbances. The definitions of resistance and resilience suggest new change and seem opposed to that of disturbance, which is change. Forests are all about change. Notice I've included some version of stand dynamics in the last several slides. Forests are constantly changing. I think sometimes we don't realize that because of the scale. Trees and forests work on a much longer time scale than we do. If an old growth stand experiences a stand replacing fire, the forest will likely recover, but you will not see it in that stage again in your lifetime. And time is but one scale to take into consideration. If you look at the picture on the left, you see total devastation of a stand of trees due to wildfire. But if you step back and look at the entire landscape, you see a mosaic of different stand types resulting from wildfire. There are stands that were completely consumed by fire, which will likely regenerate as aspen stands. The stands that were likely to moderately burned have now been thinned out, while some stands were not burned at all, retaining their original structure. This mosaic of stand types increases the diversity of the forest, and therefore the diversity of the species residing therein. That's considered healthy. So looking at the picture on the left, you may think, wow, that's total devastation. But if you change the scale to the picture on the right, one may argue that, hey, that's a healthy forested landscape. Preservation of natural disturbance regimes is considered to be essential to promote healthy, dynamic ecosystems. Many attempts to suppress disturbance are now proving deleterious to the long-term healthy function of our forests. Fire suppression is a good example. We are taught that in order to return our forests to a healthy state, we should mimic these natural disturbances. And that's easy enough in a forest that was historically located in a frequent fire regime. We can just thin it out and run a prescribed fire through it. What do we do with a forest that historically experienced stand replacing fires? A lot of those stands don't do well after they're thinned, especially stands that contain Western red cedar. My house is located within a forest that historically experienced the stand replacing fire regime. Do I want to clear cut my stand to promote forest health, diversity, and forest succession over our landscape? Not really. Although I wouldn't mind some aspen. Trying to promote forest health by mimicking natural disturbances is much easier at the landscape level than it is at the stand level. At the stand level, you have a lot less to work with. For this reason, as a small forest landowner, we have the tendency to focus on the acute biotic and abiotic issues occurring within our stands, such as bark beetle outbreaks. What we should really be focusing on is preventing or reducing the effects of the predisposing and inciting factors such as climate change and drought. That's why it's so important to figure out why you have bark beetles in your stand. There are a number of management strategies that we can deploy to prevent both biotic and abiotic stresses. One is thinning. Thinning can reduce competition for resources such as water, and it can lower the risk of a stand replacing fire. But how you thin your forest really depends on the forest type and the disturbances present. Just like everything else we've talked about, thinning is not as straightforward and easy as we sometimes like to make it sound, especially if you're thinning to improve forest health. Sometimes thinning can actually decrease forest health if you do not pay attention to the other disturbances present. Root disease is a really good example of that. Diversity, not only of tree species, but also of age classes, is important. Many insects and diseases only affect certain species and or age classes within a species. Therefore, the more species and age classes you have, the less likely an insect or disease can take out the entire stand. The same is true of abiotic issues. Drought affects different species and different age classes in different ways. The more species and age classes you have, the more likely you are to come out of an exceptional drought, such as the one we're experiencing this year, with at least some survivors into the future. Finally, you want to have at least some regeneration in your stand. Yes, regeneration can be a ladder fuel, pulling fire up into the canopy. But if you space your trees deliberately, you can avoid this risk. Regeneration is necessary if you want your stand to continue to be a stand into perpetuity. If you have to plant trees in order to promote the next generation, be sure to select appropriate genotypes. You don't want to plant subalpine fir from Arizona and Eastern Washington. And in the case of something like Western white pine, you may want to plant improved seedlings that are resistant to white pine blister rust. So what have we learned? Abiotic and biotic disturbances, their interactions and outcomes are complex and they're very hard to predict. Managing a forest or even a stand within a forest is not an easy task. Here we are only considering abiotic and biotic disturbance in relation to forest health, and it is already complex. We have not even considered other issues such as wildlife, forest practices, or specific management goals. The best we can do is decide what our management goals are, take that information we receive, and make well-informed decisions. If you ever feel like you've made a mistake, try not to be too hard on yourself. I suspect that we can argue that nobody has ever properly managed a forest, especially since the definition of a properly managed forest varies from person to person. And with that, I'm going to leave you with a list of very minuscule references for this presentation in case you feel like looking anything up on the internet. And I'll take any questions.
So it looks like we have one question in the Q&A box here, so I'll read that one right here from Melissa. Question is, do you have any predictions on the fate of Douglas fir in lower or mid elevations where it interfaces with ponderosa pine?
So I'm going to base my predictions on papers that I've read regarding Douglas fir and climate change. And just looking at their water use, Douglas fir are considered to be probably pretty resistant into the future. But because the one slide when I was talking about the secondary beetles, because we don't think about other things that would go into this model, such as secondary beetles suddenly becoming aggressive and acting like a primary bark beetle, it's really hard to say. Generally, the species should do well under a new climate change regime, but given other factors involved, you can't really say. It's impossible to say. That's why it's really good to have as many species as possible on your land, if you can do that. A lot of people have those, basically monocultures of ponderosa pine or lodgepole pine. And in those cases, even just having numerous age classes would be helpful.
All right, thanks, Melissa. That's the only question I have in the Q&A or the chat. If there's anybody else that has anything, please go ahead and drop it in there, or even we've got a small enough group. If you want to raise your hand, we've got a fairly small group here. We could even do it that way if we wanted to, but I'll give it a minute or two here if anybody's got any other questions.
And I'll stick around for Dave's talk. So if anybody has any questions come up while we're sitting here, I can answer it later.
Yeah, we'll make sure we'll have some extra time probably at the end for a little longer Q&A if we need to catch any straggling questions from either presentation, probably. So that'll work. So we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I don't want to cheat on a break here. So maybe we'll just take a short break. Maybe we won't take a 15. Let's see if we'll just take a 10-minute break. Oh, got another question here. I just popped in here. Do you still do site visits?
Yes, I do. Sure, you can contact me at through my email or my cell phone. I'll put it here in the chat. Can everybody see this chat?
Yeah, if you put it in the chat, everybody should see the chat.
Okay. Here's my email, and I'll put my cell phone number in here. Yeah, I am definitely still doing site visits. So if you'd like me to come and take a look at any forest health issues you might have, feel free to contact me and we can set something up.
Here we have another question here for you, Melissa. I have small stands of aspens within mostly ponderosa with some fir. Any forest issues due to the aspens?
Do you mean aspen? I guess I need more specifics. Do you mean forest issues in relation to the aspen bringing in issues, or?
Yeah, he said yes.
Or, okay. Well, as far as things like as biotic issues like insects and disease, aspen have their own insects and disease, and they have a lot of them, but those things don't typically cross over and affect conifers in any way. It's just pretty specific to aspen. I'm reading a question in the chat there. I don't have a tree farm, just bought 6 acres of land. Can someone come out to assess my forest? I'm at Newman Lake. And yes, the answer to that is yes. I could come out as a forest health specialist, or I could hook you up with one of the landowner assistance foresters with the DNR to come and take a look. It depends on what sort of questions you have. And there's another question in the chat. This is off the topic, but could you explain the cycle that ponderosa pine sheds its needles? I'm assuming you mean the fall cycle. So yeah, conifers in general, they do actually have a fall needle drop, and it doesn't occur every year. Typically what they do is drop their oldest needles because they're basically not really contributing much as far as photosynthesis goes, and retaining them is basically more trouble than it's worth for the tree. They're using up way too many resources than they're putting in. So that's why they tend to drop those old needles in the fall. This fall, I'm sure a lot of you have noticed that we are having a pretty intense fall needle drop. And that is definitely due to the drought. I mean, the cedars look like they're losing just about all of their older needles. They're probably going to look pretty thin next year. But yeah, I mean, fall needle drop is quite normal. But this year, I think we're experiencing a pretty intense needle drop, maybe more than 1 year's worth of needles for a lot of the species, because they just didn't have enough water to really keep up with all the needles.
Just pausing here. Haven't had any other new questions come in. Give it just another half a minute here and see if anybody pops anything in here.
And Mary, down at Newman Lake, she can, if you want to just give me a call or send me an email and let me know, I can definitely either come out myself to look at your property or have someone come out. You're welcome, John.
Okay, not seeing anything else come in, so I think we'll just want to say thank you to Melissa for your time for your presentation this evening. And I think with that, we'll take not quite a 15-minute break. Let's take a break and come back at 6:55. Give you a chance for a stretch break, get a cup of coffee, and we'll start back up at 6:55. Well, I hope everybody's back from our break. We'll go ahead and get started on our second half of our seminar this evening. I'll to welcome our next presenter, Dr. David W. Peterson. Dr. Peterson is a research forester with the Pacific Northwest Research Station here in Wenatchee. He's going to discuss some post-fire management strategies and especially exploring some tools for landowners to implement in the event that your forest land unfortunately gets burned. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dave.
All right, thanks, Darren. And thank you all for inviting me to give this presentation tonight and for taking the time to come listen. I'm going to try to share my screen here. If I can find let's hope that's the right one.
Yep, you got it, Dave.
Okay, good. All right. So yeah, so tonight, again, my talk tonight is going to be kind of a potpourri of kind of walking through different aspects of post-fire forest dynamics and different management objectives and tools that might come into play. And I'll sort of say from the outset that some of my bias tends to be toward the higher severity fires, just because that's kind of what I've known more about. Low severity fires, I kind of think of as a restoration tool, so fire good. But I'll try to make distinctions where I can. So as we've kind of noted, and I think everybody's fairly familiar, wildfire trends have been going up in recent decades. We've seen generally increases in area burned, average wildfire size, and both the total amount of high severity fire and also just the proportion of area that's burning at high severity fire. And as we talked about earlier, it's kind of this era of mega fires. So we have actually not really, there's not really a trend in the total number of fires, but just we're getting more big fires, and that's what's driving a lot of this. And of course, just to kind of review wildfire effects, depending on severity, not all these will apply, but basically we kill a lot of vegetation, sometimes just understory vegetation, sometimes understory and overstory trees, which has one effect is to reduce water uptake and evapotranspiration. So that alters forest hydrology and soil water dynamics. It consumes litter and coarse woody debris and exposes bare soil. Can alter soil physical and chemical properties through primarily through heating, but also through altered water movement. Wildlife habitats often altered in some way. Converting live trees to dead trees usually does something. And then we also increase this risk of secondary disturbances or subsequent disturbances, whether that be soil erosion related flooding and mass wasting, could be from insect outbreaks in damaged but surviving trees, or future fires, probably others you could think of. So kind of want to focus on some of these different post-fire processes and associated management concerns and objectives. So again, I've kind of alluded to water and soil movement change as a result of fire. There's issues of post-fire snag and log dynamics. We're creating a pulse of coarse woody debris that's going to change over time. There's loss of timber economic value. We're taking a bunch of trees that have been slowly accumulating wood, and you can read that as carbon or timber value over time, and sort of in one fell swoop, we turn it from an grading asset to something that is going to decline over time. So carbon, I kind of lump economic value and carbon sequestration in a sort of a similar vein because they both trend more or less in the same direction. Wildlife habitat dynamics, post-fire fuel dynamics, forest regeneration, all these are processes that kind of change as a result of fire and then undergo some changes over time. So we have some post-fire management objectives that kind of go along that mimic those. We want to protect human health and property after fires from subsequent disturbances, limits runoff and soil erosion, partly to protect people and also just to maintain forest productivity and infrastructure. Recover in some cases, we want to recover economic value from timber. In other cases, not so much. We want to often, if municipal water supplies or even just domestic irrigation systems are affected, we want to protect water quality and quantity. Often repair fire suppression damage. Bulldozers kind of tend to make a mess, and then do some kind of. We often, if we can anticipate some of these subsequent disturbances, they may be things that we want to mitigate or prevent. Often noxious weeds or just exotic species in general can spread after disturbances. And, particularly in case of things like spotted owl habitat, if we lose some habitat, we want to work extra hard to protect what's left. In other cases, we may want to protect the new habitat that's just been formed. So there's some couple different approaches to post-fire management that often find themselves competing, but they're not really mutually exclusive. Well, I guess they are in any particular one place, but they're not mutually exclusive from a big picture perspective. One is sort of the natural recovery approach. It's a passive approach, do no harm, assumes that fires are natural and ecosystems will recover on their own. We want to limit intervention, maybe limited intervention, maybe to fix some damage caused by human suppression efforts or minor things like that, but and manage risks to people, But for the most part, we're going to let nature kind of recover on its own, and we're going to assume that there's going to be some benefits along with some hazards associated with that. The opposite approach is kind of active management, assumes that management can accomplish good things, that natural recovery doesn't always produce the desired results, or that inaction just poses unacceptable risks. And it may be important to recover, if predict things like economic value or regeneration, where we think, well, we're not into long-term shrub fields or something, or we don't want to lose the value in the timber. Just some other, these are just other random thoughts that sort of can influence post-fire management decisions. Landscape to ecosystem stand conditions before fire. Were things working well before the fire, or did we have degraded conditions? What about the disturbance size? I mean, what you might do in a 10-acre fire might be different from what you do in a 10,000-acre fire or a 100,000-acre fire. It certainly affects the sort of the amount of the pulse of new resources. Landowner and stakeholder values. If you're a private landowner who's owns 100 acres and you were planning of trees and you were planning that's your retirement account, you might have a very different attitude toward this, where if you're the Department of Fish and Wildlife and you have 100,000 acres in forest and only a small amount of it burned, and you say, yay, new snags. I'm exaggerating, but the point is landowner and stakeholder values differ among landowners and across landscapes. In some cases, there's also policy and legal constraints. Melissa's from DNR. I know DNR's situation may have changed in recent years, but I remember back in grad school, talking to people from the DNR, and they said, well, I'm sorry you don't like that we harvest trees, but we're under a constitutional mandate to provide economic benefits to build schools in the state, and it's in the Constitution, and that's what we need to do. But on the other token, people may not do something if they're under some requirement that says if we regenerate after fire, we have to show a model that says we're going to get a certain economic return on our investment. These are just public sector things. Private sector, I'm sure, have other similar kinds of things. And also just note that, fire effects really do vary across time and space. And so what we see in one place is not what we see in the other place. And something that looks bad in the year 1 might look really good in year 5. Just some ideas. So the first part of my talk, I want to talk about an area of work that I have done in the past, largely around the Forest Service's Burned Area Emergency Response Program, but I think it has even more general application. So I've called it Post-Fire Vegetation Recovery and Management and Limiting Post-Fire Soil Erosion Hazards. So severe wildfires can, increase post-fire runoff and erosion hazards by killing living plants, consuming surface organic matter off the soil, exposing bare mineral soil to wind and water. Again, reducing evapotranspiration, which means there's more water in the soils and they're more likely to get saturated. In some cases, it's the opposite, where we get increased soil water repellency, so water wants to run off the top. In other cases, we get preferential flow paths developing, so water wants to sink in and go deep and out of the way of young roots of newly establishing plants. So we can get reduced infiltration capacity and increase surface runoff in some cases. In other cases, we might get even deep infiltration. So it's always very complex. Now, the erosion hazards tend to decline naturally as after wildfire as soil cover increases, whether that's live vegetation or dead organic cover. So as understory vegetation recovers and grows, the live vegetation itself will intercept incoming precipitation and sort of reduce the raindrop impacts. As vegetation, sheds leaves and small bits, we get it replaces soil surface litter and organic soil cover. As dead trees fall down, they can actually serve as soil cover as well, and also can trap sediment movement before it gets too far. And then, of course, we have, as trees regrow, they perform all these functions. So we've done some different studies looking at vegetation recovery, particularly in the context of this sort of first 2 or 3 years after fire, and the implications for erosion control. I want to basically make the point that vegetation recovery is really variable. On this colorful slide here with the green and the red, apologize to any colorblind folks. It basically just shows 8 different sites we had within one drainage near Lake Chelan. Actually, 7 of these 8 have recently burned in 25 Mile Creek, so we'll get to test it all over again. But this is just 8 sites within half of the 25 Mile Creek drainage that burned in the Pot Peak fire. And you can see the first year plant cover ranging anywhere from less than 5% on site 2 up to almost 40% on site 3. This other graphic on the right shows is from the Tripod fire that burned in 2006, where we were looking at did a post-fire veg recovery study in conjunction with mulching, and looked at just how this recovery varied across an elevational gradient. You could see these lower elevation sites that typically had more grasses and dry shrubs and stuff coming back much quicker than the higher elevation sites that were with less fire tolerant vegetation. Another study we've been looking at, which is a little off topic, but it shows that restoration treatments effectiveness can carry through even through a fire. Looking at the 2014 Carlton fire, we had it burned through some stands that had received restoration treatments about 10 years prior. And we wanted to look at how these different treatments, like particularly burn only and thin and burn, affect the ability of understory vegetation to recover after fire. So you can see, if we look at similar stands that didn't burn, they had just 60 to 70% plant cover. But in year 1, you can see that the burn only and the thin and burn stands had significantly more cover than the ones that hadn't been treated, almost double in some cases in year 1, though that kind of evens out by year 2 and 3. And there's not really much difference in total plant species richness. It's just that it seems like maybe I believe it's the burn treatments that basically pre-adapt the understory vegetation to fire. Now, if natural post-fire recovery is expected to be slow, we do have some erosion control treatments we can use. Just in no particular order, mulching, I guess, is one of the more recent ones, kind of emulates post-fire needle cast, or the shedding of dead material off of trees. Seeding, I think of as emulating either soil seed banks or canopy seed banks or long-distance seed dispersal. Fertilization kind of emulates or enhances a sort of a natural post-fire nutrient flux when you have a low severity fire. And you have these physical structures, which I don't know if they're used as much anymore, but basically the idea, like log dams and that sort of thing, that basically kind of mimic the falling down of snags. We've done a few studies on these. Fertilization and seeding, we looked at the 2004 Pot Peak fire a little, and you could see that basically the fertilization had caused a small increase in first and second year plant cover, particularly when we combined it with this worm seed treatment, which turned out actually it was mostly yarrow that was in there that made a big difference. Similarly, in a different study after the Carlton complex fire, we did an experiment or management experiment with seeding grasses with and without or with different amounts of grass seed that had mycorrhizal inoculum in it. And turned out that, you know, the mycorrhizal inoculum seemed to have a really nice effect, and we got really good seeded species cover in both years 1 and years 2. Not so big an effect on total plant cover, however, and not such a big effect on the amount of bare soil. And a lot of that really has to do with the idea that in this case, the seeded grasses were basically taking resources away from primarily the shrubs, woody plants. So we had less cover and a little bit less woody species richness, but we had a lot more grasses. So some benefit in the first year, but there's some potential long-term effects on biodiversity and community development. Another approach is aerial mulching was tried quite extensively in the 2006 tripod fire. Mulching with straw, you know, provides very rapid and relatively predictable soil cover after fire. It's an engineering approach. You put it down, you can see you have it. It's pricey, but you can do it. And what we wanted to do a little study just to see, you know, did that also interfere with natural vegetation recovery? It turned out that really it was pretty minimal unless they had the moisture levels wrong on the straw. Turns out you have to kind of, if the moisture level is wrong, it comes down in clumps. If it's dry enough, it really does a nice job of fanning out. And so when we looked at these things, you can see it's really only here when we got more than about 5 centimeters of mulch depth that it started actually suppressing the vegetation cover. So another topic I wanted to talk about a little bit is another big study that we've completed, looking at snag persistence, wildlife usage, and surface fuel deposition following stand replacing wildfires. Obviously, large, high severity wildfire patches create challenges for snag management. And really the question we're trying to answer was, well, when we, again, not talking so much about small patches of dead trees, but when we get these mega fires with lots of dead trees, and particularly uncharacteristically severe fires, you know, what do we do with them all? How long are they going to be there? What's going to happen to them over time, and what's their value and role? So some people see fire-killed trees as an economic resource, and this was particularly true traditionally. It's been less true in recent years, but I think it's still out there. You know, and the idea that we could convert dead trees to forest products or fuel or whatever provides some economic benefits to local communities. An idea that's not, I don't think, is promoted very well, but I think there's some merit to, is this idea of carbon sequestration. So if you can take that wood and either put it into a long-lasting wood product or use that wood in lieu of some fossil fuel or cutting down a live tree that's still accumulating carbon, there may be actually some carbon benefits to harvesting these dead trees, because once they're dead, they do start to decay and lose their carbon. Some see fire-killed trees as current and future wildlife habitat, and certainly you don't have to go back more than a decade or two to when we really had some serious snag deficits in many parts of our forest, because we'd been kind of managing to get rid of snags for a long time. I think I would argue that between the droughts, the bug kill, and the fires, that many of those same forests do no longer have a snag deficit. Many have a snag surplus, but we still have these, you know, both invertebrate communities and you know, primary cavity nesters that do depend on, and I guess I would put it as a continuous supply of snags for both foraging and nesting habitat. Some see fire-killed trees as a source of fuels for future wildfires. So these decomposing snags are going to fall down and generate surface woody fuels over time. And in a frequent fire regime where we expect fire return intervals to be, say, 30 years or less, the fuels generated by one fire, particularly a high severity fire, can definitely influence subsequent fire behavior and effects. It's just going to change the amount of fuel that's on the ground, and potentially, even if it doesn't change the rate of spread, if it changes the residence time and the amount of soil heating we get and the amount that, that heat, the length of time that heat is produced, then we can get tree mortality as well. And this has often been kind of articulated as, higher fuel loads producing a high severity reburn. In some cases, those high severity reburns are natural. Lodgepole pine's really rather good at high severity reburns. But in the ponderosa pine forests and stuff, then historically, you would not have gotten a high severity reburn at scales bigger than, an acre or 2 or 10. Well, I guess Paul Hesburgh would probably argue with that. It would be rare. Let's say you could certainly get it, but they would not have been the dominant theme. So the kind of comes the question, well, how do we balance economic values, wildlife habitat values, and fuels management needs? Well, one of the things is we need information about these snag decomposition rates and how long do snags stay in each kind of condition? How does snag size and species influence their persistence overall, habitat contributions, and fuel contributions? So we did this Eastside snag dynamics and fuel succession study, where we looked at 55 different wildfires that had burned between 1970 and 2009 in Eastern Washington and Oregon. And just to kind of give you sort of the broad brush strokes, there's a lot of graphs here. Main thing to note is that we have small, medium, that was interesting. Small, medium, large, and very large diameter snags, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and true fir. Oops. There we go. Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and western larch combined, grand fir and white fir, and lodgepole pine here. So diameter here, time since fire along the X, and really just these solid black lines show the probability that a snag will still be standing at a certain time since fire, and the dashed line going up is the probability that if it's standing, it will have a broken top. And so what we see basically is most snags either break off or fall between 5 and 15 years after fire. If you're a large true fir or Douglas fir, you're more likely to stay standing for a long time, but you're probably going to break off sooner than, and so you just kind of be a broken off snag. Ponderosa pine and lodgepole pines fall faster than Douglas firs or true firs. Small diameter snags are falling faster than large diameter snags, not too big a surprise. And the fall rates appear to taper off after the snags develop broken tops. So you can see these lines kind of flatten out a little bit more. So we're still slowly falling, but not as fast. And that's, less wind interception. Just some similar trends, changes in snag decay class, where we're just using a three decay class. So these black areas represent pretty soft snags that you could kind of kick your foot into pretty easily. The gray are snags that have lost a lot of their branches and tops, but are still fairly structurally sound. And so basically, again, we're seeing most branches and tops are falling in the first 10 to 15 years. And soft snags are developing starting around 10 to 20 years after fire, and then become dominant around 30 years after fire. Similar story for the logs, just kind of a mirror image. Another part of the study, we wanted to look for cavities in standing snags and see basically which kinds of snags the cavity nesters were using. Because it's a retrospective study, we don't know exactly what year they were used. We can only tell that they had been used prior to our visit. But what we basically found is most cavities were found in stands that were sampled 10 to 20 years after fire. Most cavities were found in medium to large diameter snags. So almost 2/3 were found in 30 to 60 centimeter diameter snags. And about a little over 20% were in bigger than that, and the remainder were smaller than that. So really a broad range of diameters were used. Only about a little over 2% of the standing snags actually had a cavity in it. And 43% of the stands that we sampled had at least one cavity snag. So not every snag is being used by cavity nesters, obviously, and not every stand is. And so that's kind of an area for future look is, can we see which stands, is there some way of predicting where the cavity nesters are going to want to be? There's some evidence in recent papers that proximity to unburned forest, or at least low severity forest, low severity burned forest might be the kind of one of the keys for that. But there's also aspect issues and where the thermal regulation works and that sort of thing. And also note that, you have to infer it from this, but given that it looks like most of these stands are being used by cavity nesters in the 10 to 20 year range when they have soft wood, that's not the same time as most of the foraging for like wood borers and bark beetles would be occurring. So you kind of get the idea that, there's sort of a spatial substitution that maybe while they're foraging on those newly created snags, they're living in older snags somewhere else, and then they'll move into these new snags while they're foraging somewhere else. I'm not a wildlife biologist, so if somebody's out there who can tell me I'm wrong on that, that is fine. But the data sort of suggests that there is that sort of temporal segregation going on there. Finally, I want to look at the surface woody fuels changing over time as snags decompose. What we found was that this pattern of surface woody fuels increasing for 15 to 20 years after fire. That's basically a time when all those tops are falling off, the branches are falling off, and the smaller snags are falling entirely. At some point there, around 15 to 20 years, we saw the accumulation sort of cease, and we saw kind of a gradual decline. Some of that's because I think decomposition is kind of catching up with deposition. Some of it may also be in those really older stands that some of those may have not been as dense to begin with. And we can kind of account for that, but not entirely. Large rotten fuels are increasing for 40 years or more. So over time, those large diameter fuels are becoming more rotten. But interestingly, and I was surprised by this, was that there's relatively small differences in the timing among fuel size classes. Sort of thought we would see the small diameter fuels pulsing first, followed, and more evidence of the large diameters later on. And there's a little bit of that, but not really enough to talk about. A couple other notes on this is that the fuels deposited are proportional to basal area killed. That was a stand level thing that we could account for. So if you have a stand replacing fire in a very dense stand, you're going to get more fuels than if you have a stand replacing fire in a not so dense stand. Not rocket science. And obviously low severity fires where you don't kill as many trees produce smaller feedback on fuels than moderate and high severity. So I think that really just boils down to restoration treatments that we're trying to do on these dry forests can reduce these mortality feedbacks on future fires by promoting tree survival on the one hand, and also just reducing stand densities and basal area on the other hand. So if the weather does trump the restoration treatment and all the trees die, there's just fewer of them out there. So how can we manage those future woody fuels? Well, I've got three answers. One is basically leave them alone, the passive approach, and basically wait for the next fire to clean up the fuels. And we do this a lot. And sometimes it works, and sometimes we get results that we don't like so much. If there's values at risk, we can use repeated prescribed fires over time to consume the fuel kind of as it accumulates. So maybe you go in 10 or 15 years later and do some prescribed burning, or manage wildfire if that happens to work. And so we can kind of whittle away at a time and prevent ourselves from getting large amounts of down woody debris and rotten fuel at the same time. Or another approach is to harvest the snags shortly after fire and take the wood out of there before it decays. So we looked at the post-fire logging on some of those same stands that we were, or the same fires that we were looking at, the snags, and found that post-fire logging can reduce these future fuel loads after a transient increase. So if you log a bunch of recently fire-killed trees and you leave slash on the ground, you temporarily at least increase the amount of fuel on the ground relative to an unlogged stand next door. That your reward for doing that is you get a long-term reduction in large woody fuels. You also, around somewhere between 7 and 10 years, it tends to cross over, so that, and that's about the time when all those branches and tops would have been on, are going to fall onto the ground, even if you don't log them. So at that point, you kind of break even. And we have this time period from basically 10 years out to 25, 30 years, where there's an actual benefit of reduced fuels as a result of logging those snags. Long-term, the long-term benefit is only in the large fuels though. So we have this extended period of reduced woody fuels, and it's worth noting that this can also facilitate future prescribed fire use, because you have less fuel to begin with, so it's easier to put fire through, and you have a broader range of conditions under which you can do prescribed fire. Finally, I think I was asked if I would talk a little bit about post-fire logging or salvage logging, and I might as well. But I think it's worth saying when and where, not if and should you log or should you not log, so much as when and where should you think about logging, and when and where should you probably not think about logging. So there's some potential benefits to post-fire logging or salvage logging. I mean, the immediate one is recovering economic value, but there's also issues like improving safety, getting rid of potentially falling snags along roads, trails, and other areas where humans are going to be, particularly on windy days. There's limit those future surface woody fuels pulses from decomposing snags, like we just talked about. For some people, well, a bunch of standing dead snags are not aesthetically pleasing. So in some cases, you might just do it for improved aesthetics, or for safety, walking around. You know, if it's an area you're going to have people moving through, and you don't want to be climbing over logs all the time. And also then there's some potential forest regeneration benefits, either because you make some money off the trees, which allows you to fund the artificial regeneration, or simply just keeps trees from falling on your new trees, or snags from falling on your new trees. Of course, there's also some negatives. Many have argued that post-fire logging exacerbates the negative impacts of wildfire on soils, vegetation, aquatic habitats, and a variety of other things. And in some cases, that is most certainly true. In other cases, I think we tend to kind of confuse the fire effects and the logging effects. And so in some cases, there may be issues where the fire has actually done most of the damage, and you have a short window of opportunity where you could do something more and not really have, it's already bad, so you're not going to make it any worse. And there's actually some indication in some cases logging might make it better, but there's no question there are some negative impacts, and particular things like aquatic habitats, or if you have to build a road, heaven forbid, to get to the trees, not good. You are reducing some of this foraging and nesting habitat benefits for wildlife. And so the question there is, you know, how much habitat is there, and do you need it all, or is there sort of a surplus? And so you could log some areas and leave the rest, and the wildlife would be able to do just fine on what was left behind. Sorry, my voice is going here. We can reduce, you're going to reduce coarse woody debris inputs to forest soils. Again, it's a question of how much you want and how much you need. And finally, one that, you know, there's always a question is, are you sure the tree is dead? Ponderosa pine is the main problem there. A lot of difficulty sometimes without having a forest health person chop into it and look at the phloem or something. But I mean, just ponderosa pine can get a lot of scorch and still be alive. I guess I repeated that here, but the challenges I think are, is it really going to pay? What's the market value of the timber? How far is it to the mill? Do you have access? Can you get someone to do it? Speed, can you really harvest the wood before the decay agents diminish its value to the point where it doesn't pay anymore? And then, like I say, is it really dead? And I think my last thoughts on the post-fire logging is we have to remember, especially in an era of megafire, we don't have to do the same thing everywhere. We need to diversify our landscapes. We know this from restoration work. And so there's it doesn't have to be log everything like I kind of did here, or don't log anything. We can do a little of both. From a wildlife foraging and nesting perspective, you see a lot of studies about wildlife prefer dense snags, and that's almost certainly true. That doesn't mean they absolutely require every snag that's out there, or that they can't live on something that's left behind. I always remember that, when these fires happen, the wildlife come from someplace, and when the snag's no good anymore, they're going someplace else later. So we really want to look at it from a big picture and say, is there a sustainable, adequate habitat resource? And if I log this, is there still going to be a sustainable, adequate resource? And then just this idea of, are there places, can we figure out basically, if you're going to log, where should you log so as to have the least detrimental effect? So those are about my thoughts on this. I welcome any questions you may have. I think I kept it just about to the time I was aiming for. So happily answer questions, and you can reach me via email here if you have further questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, for that great presentation. And it looks like we've got one question in the Q&A box so far. So it says many landowners are not able to do low intensity controlled burns, but try to mimic by doing regular thinning. Do you have an opinion or aware of any research on how closely thinning mimics the benefits of low intensity fires?
I have an opinion and a little bit of research. So when we do sort of the classic restoration with thinning and burning, or thinning or burning, there's two main differences I think that stick out. One is that if you do thinning without burning, you tend to increase your surface fuel loads. You can mitigate that by how you deal with your slash, but there is a question of, are you actually increasing the surface fuel loads if you're leaving material behind? If you're not, then I think the other main difference would be, as I kind of referred to in terms of like understory vegetation, you may not be getting some of the biodiversity benefits or the fire resilience benefits of experiencing fire. So when you do put fire through, I think you kind of, you weed out some of the shade tolerant but not very fire tolerant species, and that might not be a big deal, but those would be the two main differences I would see. But in terms of canopy fuels and ladder fuels and stuff, hey, thinning's great.
All right, thanks, Dave. Not seeing any more questions at this moment. So while people give people a minute or two to think a bit more, I'm going to go ahead and make a plug, take a minute and plug next week's session while people are thinking of any additional questions here real quick. So if you, a reminder for next week, the next same time, 6 p.m. next Thursday, the 23rd, we'll have our last third and final session of our fall forestry seminar, which will talk about climate change impacts and prescribed fire and smoke issues. And it looks like, oh, there, see, now we have a question. Here's another one for you, Dave. This one might be anecdotal, but after the 30-mile and tripod fires, the forest has not come back significantly in 20 and 15 years, respectively. Was it the severity of the burn, the restoration, or am I off?
I can't comment too much on 30-mile, but I do get up to tripod a lot. So I'm going to assume that they're probably similar issues. One of the big issues we've had is just the magnitude, the size of the high severity patches. That it's not such a big deal for lodgepole pine regeneration if there was lodgepole there before and you've got the cone seed bank available to regenerate it. But for a lot of the other species, it's just a really long way to the nearest seed source. And so if the forest isn't putting in artificial regeneration, it's going to be a really slow process, because you'll get an occasional, you get some occasional seed movement into even a large patch, but if you have to wait for that tree to become seed bearing in order to spread any further, regen can be really slow. And I'm seeing it even in some other, some parts of the Carlton fire are having the same issue, where we're actually doing regen surveys this summer. And you realize there's nothing there, but it's also really long way to the nearest live tree. I think that went through my head when there was a question on Melissa's talk about how Douglas fir would do. And that's a very open question. Anybody can come up with a lot of answers. But one thing that came through my head was, the one thing Douglas fir has on ponderosa pine, it's not as good with drought, but it can spread its seed a lot further. And so you may get some things where you have these large fires that wipe out the ponderosa pine, and they come back as Doug fir just because that's the only seed that can get there. Historically, ponderosa pine kind of specialized in just surviving the fire, even if it's just a lone tree in the middle of, one big tree, and then that tree could just take its time spreading seed over the next few years. But between logging and these and forest growth, where those trees get choked up and then they die because of stand replacing fire, you have a really long distance to seed source, and they just can't get there.
And see, thanks for your response there, to your answer there, Dave. And no new questions at this point in the chat box or in the Q&A. While we're waiting for another minute or two, I just drop the link for the seminar survey into the chat box for you to please participate and respond to that survey. We'll use that information for feedback on what you thought of this year's seminar, but also give us some input into thoughts for our future seminar for next year. And that'll also come out as in an email as well, shortly after the seminar as well, into your email box, in case you missed the link. And still not seeing any other questions at this point.
I should say thanks to Craig for the comment about the Cold Springs fire and the log structures. I think that was probably referred to the sort of the erosion control treatments, and so it's good to know those are still being used. I just haven't heard about them near me lately.
So I'm not seeing anything else pop up here. So Thank you, Dave, for your time this evening, and let's give a, if we can, we'll give a virtual round of applause to both of our presenters this evening for taking their time out to volunteer their time and share their expertise with us this evening. And we'll do one more, that gives people one more chance here to last minute questions here, or see if maybe pops in at the last second. No, okay. Well, I want to thank you everyone for participating and joining us this evening for our seminar. And like I said, a reminder for our third and final session next Thursday at 6 p.m. Covering climate change impacts and prescribed fire and smoke issues. So with that, I'll say thank you for attending, and have a good rest of your evening.